Her husband divorced her to marry her sister. And 3 days later, she inherited a $500 billion real estate empire, including the building he just threw her out of. On a Thursday morning in Midtown Atlanta, Nadia Oay sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor and listened to a lawyer she had never met read aloud the legal dissolution of her marriage. She was 6 weeks postpartum. She was still wearing compression socks. She had brought no attorney. She had brought only a manila folder and the specific, unreadable stillness of a woman who already knows something the room does not. Brennan Cole sat across from her, her husband of 5 years, founder of Cole Capital Group, a man who had once made her feel like the most important person in any room he entered. He did not look at her. Beside his attorney sat his mother, Diane, who had spent 5 years measuring Nadia against a standard she'd never shared and finding her quietly insufficient. And somewhere below them, in the Cole Capital lobby, Nadia's younger sister Abina was waiting, the woman Brennan intended to marry the moment the paperwork cleared. What none of them knew, what Brennan could not have known, what Diane, with all her social intelligence, had never once thought to investigate, was that the building they were sitting in, all 38 floors of it, the address Diane called Brennan's greatest professional achievement, belonged to Nadia, had belonged to her family for 37 years. And as of 4:47 the previous afternoon, it belonged to Nadia alone. He divorced her in her own building. He just didn't know it was hers. This isn't just a story about a man who chose the wrong woman to discard. It's about what happens when a lifetime of quiet preparation meets a single moment of breathtaking arrogance. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, this one is for you. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, to understand what Nadia was holding in that manila folder and why she came to that meeting alone, we need to go back to where this story really began. To understand what happened that Thursday morning in Midtown Atlanta, we need to go back to where this story really began. Not to the marriage, not even to the diagnosis. We need to go back to a man named Kwame Emmanuel Oay, who arrived in Atlanta in the summer of 1969 with $42, a contractor's license from the state of Ohio, and a philosophy he never wrote down until the very end. Kwame was not a complicated man in the way that complicated men announce themselves. He was quiet in the way that rivers are quiet, not because nothing is moving, but because the movement is happening where you cannot see it. He drove a 2009 Toyota Camry that he refused to replace. He wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation from October through March. He ate the same lunch every day for 30 years. Groundnut soup from a thermos his wife packed before she died, and then, afterward, from a thermos he packed himself, because some habits are worth keeping even when the person who gave them to you is gone. He did not discuss money in social settings. He did not discuss the portfolio at all. What Kwame did was work, quietly, systematically, and without any apparent need for anyone to notice. In 1971, he purchased a duplex on Delmar Street in Decatur, Georgia, for $34,000. He fixed it himself over 3 weekends. He rented both units by the following month. He did not celebrate. He looked for the next one. Over the next 51 years, Kwame Emmanuel Oay purchased, developed, or acquired 203 properties across Atlanta, Savannah, Augusta, and Macon. Commercial buildings, residential complexes, event spaces, office towers. In 1987, he formalized the portfolio under Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC, a Georgia limited liability company whose structure he spent 18 months designing with a young attorney named James Opong Asante, who would spend the next 3 decades making sure no one could touch it without Kwame's explicit permission. The crown jewel was 1140 Peachtree Street. Kwame broke ground on it in 1987, the same year he formed the LLC, on a parcel he had quietly assembled from 4 adjacent lots over a decade of patient waiting. 38 floors. Grand atrium lobby with a ceiling that rose 60 feet and caught the afternoon light in a way that made first-time visitors stop walking. Kwame walked through that atrium the week before it opened, stood in the center of the lobby floor, and looked up at the ceiling for a long time. He said nothing to the contractor beside him. He simply looked. Then he nodded once and walked back out. His daughter Nadia was 9 years old. She was with him that day, small and watchful in a way she would carry into adulthood, and she looked up at the ceiling too. Not because she understood what she was looking at, but because her father was looking at it, and that was reason enough. Kwame never told her the building was hers. He showed her instead. The legal architecture was meticulous and deliberate. Before Nadia married Brennan Cole in the spring of 19 years later, Kwame sat across from James Opong Asante and drafted a separate property trust that ring-fenced the entire Oay portfolio from the marriage. A prenuptial agreement, prepared by James, reviewed by 2 independent attorneys, signed by Brennan without apparent concern because Kwame was, to Brennan's thoroughly underinformed eye, a retired contractor who drove an old Camry and dressed like a man who shopped at estate sales. Brennan signed it at a closing table in James's Midtown office and shook everyone's hand afterward. He thanked Kwame for raising such a grounded woman. He was standing on Kwame's land when he said it. The building that housed James's law office was an Oay portfolio property. Brennan did not know this. He would not know it for 5 more years. Kwame amended the beneficial ownership designation in 2019, the year his diagnosis came back with different numbers. The amendment was 3 pages. It named Nadia Adwoa Oay as sole managing member of Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC, upon his death, and it was filed with the Fulton County Probate Court with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been planning this moment for decades. He also wrote a letter. 1 page, handwritten on the stationery his wife had kept in the desk drawer. Nadia found it clipped to the inside of the trust documents, in the manila folder James handed her after the funeral. She read it standing in the parking lot of the hospice center, still in her funeral dress. She read it again that night. Then again the following morning. By the time the conference room scene arrived, by the time she rode the elevator to the 32nd floor of her father's building in compression socks and carried a manila folder containing a single sheet of paper she had read 47 times, she knew every word without looking. The letter said, "Nadia, the buildings will outlast everything they'll ever try to take from you. Stand in them like you own them. You do." She had not yet fully understood it. Not on the 47th reading. Not yet. The early years of the marriage were genuinely good, and this is worth saying plainly because the story is not about a bad marriage that was always bad. It is about a good marriage that a frightened man allowed to become something else. Brennan was charming in those years with the specific, practiced warmth of someone who had learned early that being liked was the most efficient form of safety. He remembered things. He asked follow-up questions. He showed up. He was kind to Kwame in the early years, genuinely engaged, the kind of son-in-law who drove the old man to doctor's appointments and sat through the same 3 stories about the duplex on Del Mar without checking his phone. Kwame liked him then. Kwame assessed people slowly and revised upward when warranted. He revised on Brennan, too, just not upward. For 4 years, the marriage held. Then Brennan's fund had a difficult quarter, and then another, and Nadia watched something shift in him, watched the warmth become selective, the attention become conditional. The man who had once made her feel like the most important person in any room began to look at her like she was a problem he was deciding whether to solve. She told herself it was stress. She was not wrong about that part. But first, the narrator said, we need to understand the man who made it all possible. Kwame Emmanuel Oay arrived in Atlanta in the summer of 1969 with the particular determination of someone who has already decided that failure is not a personal option, but simply a logistical problem to be solved. He was 22 years old, newly licensed as a contractor in the state of Ohio, and carrying a leather satchel that held $42, a change of clothes, and a notebook in which he kept a running list of properties he intended to purchase. The list at that point had 7 entries. He did not know how long it would take. He did not consider that a relevant question. He rented a room on Auburn Avenue for $11 a week and worked construction 6 days out of 7. He ate simply. He spent nothing he did not have to spend. And in 1971, 2 years after arriving with almost nothing, he purchased a duplex on Delmar Street in Decatur for $34,000, a number he had saved toward, with the methodical patience of a man who understood that every dollar was a unit of future choice and treated it accordingly. He fixed it himself over 3 weekends. He rented both units. He did not celebrate. He looked for the next property on the list. This was the rhythm of Kwame's life for 51 years. Quiet acquisition, systematic patience, the complete absence of the need to be seen doing it. He never drove a car newer than 10 years old. He wore the same 3 cardigans from October through March until they wore through at the elbows, and then he replaced them with identical ones. He attended the same church on Cascade Road for 4 decades, sat in the 4th pew, and shook the same hands afterward. He did not discuss the portfolio at neighborhood gatherings. He did not put his name on buildings. In 1987, when the portfolio had grown to 43 properties and the legal architecture required formalization, he established Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC, in a meeting with a 26-year-old attorney named James Opong Asante. And he told James 2 things at that first meeting. The first was that he wanted the structure to be invisible from the outside. The second was that he wanted it to be indestructible from the inside. James had spent the 30 years since making sure of both. The crown jewel came in that same year, 1140 Peachtree Street, a parcel assembled across a decade from 4 adjacent lots Kwame had purchased one at a time, waiting between each transaction with the patience of someone who understood that the right price and the right moment rarely arrive together, and that the only strategy is to be ready when they do. He broke ground in 1987. He watched the building go up from a camp chair on the opposite sidewalk, eating lunch from a thermos, saying nothing to the men who occasionally stopped to ask what he was looking at. When it opened, he stood in the grand atrium and looked up at the 60-foot ceiling and the afternoon light coming through the glass in columns, and the only thing he said was that his daughter would need to see this. Nadia was 9. She stood beside him and looked up because he was looking up. She did not yet know what she was inheriting. She was only beginning to learn how to stand. Before Nadia married Brennan Cole in the spring of the year she turned 30, Kwame sat in James's office on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 4 hours restructuring the beneficial ownership documentation with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been thinking about this conversation for years. The separate property trust that ring-fenced the portfolio from the marriage was 41 pages. The prenuptial agreement was another 30. Brennan signed it at a closing table without apparent concern, and without, it is worth noting, asking a single question about the nature or scale of the Oay family assets. He had looked at Kwame, at his 2009 Camry, at his cardigan, at his unhurried, unimpressive manner at family dinners, and made a calculation that was comprehensive, confident, and entirely wrong. The early years of the marriage were good. This is worth pausing on because the story is not served by forgetting it. Brennan was warm in those years with a specific and practiced generosity that Nadia found genuinely disarming. He remembered small things she mentioned once and never repeated, showed up to evenings she didn't expect him to prioritize, sat with Kwame at family dinners and asked real questions, and listened to the answers with what appeared to be real interest. Kwame assessed people slowly and without announcement. He revised his assessment of Brennan twice in the first 2 years, not upward. But Nadia was happy. Her happiness was real, and she is allowed to have had it. She did not tell Brennan the full truth about the portfolio. Not from strategy. She was not thinking in terms of strategy then. She simply understood, from a lifetime of watching her father, that there are things you hold privately, not because you distrust the person beside you, but because some knowledge is so foundational that it must be given carefully or not at all. She was waiting to be certain. She wasn't given enough time to become certain. The wedding was held at a property on West Paces Ferry Road that Kwame had owned since 1994. 214 guests. A tent in the garden. Brennan stood at the altar in a perfectly fitted suit and shook Kwame's hand afterward and told him, with apparent sincerity, that he was grateful to him for raising such a grounded woman. He was standing on Kwame's land when he said it. The tent was on Kwame's property. The catering kitchen was in a building Kwame had renovated in 2001. Brennan had no idea. He smiled and meant what he said, and understood nothing. Kwame smiled back. He was very good at that. 14 months after the wedding, Kwame's physician, Dr. Reginald Asamoah at Emory University Hospital, called him in for a follow-up appointment on a scan that had initially presented as inconclusive. The appointment took 40 minutes. Kwame drove himself home in the Camry. He called James from the driveway and left a voicemail with 3 words: "Start the amendments." Then he went inside and put the kettle on. Pancreatic cancer, stage 2. The diagnosis settled into the Oay family like weather. Not suddenly, but completely, and with the understanding that it would not be leaving any time soon. The marriage, which had felt in those first 14 months like something solid and trustworthy, was about to be tested by grief. And Brennan Cole, it would turn out, had never learned to stand still in the rain. The probate office of Fulton County closed at 5 o'clock on Tuesday afternoons. James Opong Asante called Nadia at 4:59. She was in the kitchen of her father's house in Cascade Heights, standing at the counter with her daughter Adwoa pressed against her shoulder, working the slow circles on the baby's back that had become, over 6 weeks, as automatic as breathing. Her phone screen lit up on the counter beside the formula tin. She looked at James's name. She looked at her daughter's face, eyes half closed and heavy with the particular weight of milk-drunk sleep. She finished the circles. She put Adwoa down. Then she called James back. He answered before the first ring completed. That was the first thing she noticed. James Opong Asante, in 30 years of legal practice, had never once answered a phone before the second ring. She understood from this that the news was significant enough to have made him forget himself. "Ms. Oay," he said, "the final administrative review closed this afternoon. The transfer is complete as of 4:47 p.m. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street, and its headlights passed across the window and disappeared. "All of it," Nadia said. It was not a question. "All of it. Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC. 203 properties. Full beneficial ownership. Sole managing member. Effective 4:47 today." She already knew this was coming. She had known it was coming for 118 days. And still, standing in her father's kitchen in the house where she had eaten breakfast every morning of her childhood, something moved through her chest that was not surprise and was not joy and was not grief, but was something that sat at the exact center of all three, without being any of them. She asked James 3 questions. She asked about the timeline for formal notification to existing commercial tenants. She asked whether the prenuptial documentation needed to be refiled with the divorce court or would surface automatically through financial disclosure. She asked whether the 11 Cole Capital leases were currently operating under the original courtesy terms or had been formally converted. James answered each one in order. Clean sentences. No filler. "I'll have a full briefing prepared by Friday," he said. "Thank you, James." She ended the call. The divorce papers were on the counter. They had been there since 9 that morning, hand-delivered by a man in a dark suit who had rung the bell while Nadia was feeding Adwoa, and who had left the envelope propped against the door when she didn't answer quickly enough. She had opened it, read the first 2 pages, understood what it was, and set it down. She had not opened it again. Now she stood between the 2 documents, one on the counter to her left, one in the pocket of her cardigan, the one she had carried for 118 days, the one worn soft at the fold lines from 47 readings. One document said she was being erased. One said she was whole. She picked up her father's letter. She read it standing at the counter, the way she always did, the same words in the same order she had memorized weeks ago, and read anyway because the reading itself was the thing. Her lips moved slightly on the last line. They always did on the last line. "Nadia, the buildings will outlast everything they'll ever try to take from you. Stand in them like you own them. You do." The first time she had read it, in the parking lot of the hospice in her funeral dress, the word buildings had meant something general, a philosophy, a comfort. The particular gentleness of a father who knew his daughter was about to be very much alone and wanted to leave her something that would hold. Standing in the kitchen that Tuesday night, with Adwoa asleep and the divorce papers 6 inches from her left hand, and the transfer completed at 4:47 that afternoon, the word buildings meant something entirely specific. She thought about the atrium at 1140 Peachtree, about being 9 years old and looking up at a ceiling because her father was looking at it, and not yet understanding what she was seeing. She understood it now. He had not been showing her a building. He had been showing her what patience looked like when it was finished. He had been showing her what it looked like when a quiet person finally stood in the full measure of what they had built, and did not apologize for any of it. She put the letter down. She picked up her phone. She called James a second time. He answered on the first ring again. "File everything Monday," she said. A pause. Shorter than most people's pauses. "Can you be more specific about the scope?" "Everything," she said. "The disclosure, the lease documentation, the prenuptial filing, the household account reclassification, all of it, Monday." Another pause. She could hear him making a note, the scratch of a pen on paper, the same sound she had heard in his office a dozen times across a dozen meetings, the sound of James Opong Asante treating something as real by writing it down. "I'll have it ready," he said. The call ended. Nadia stood in the kitchen for another minute without moving. Then she picked up her father's letter and placed it gently on top of the divorce papers, the same gesture she had made that morning when she came home from the 32nd floor of her father's building, when she had put the letter down on the counter without reading either document, not yet ready for what she was about to become. She was ready now. The house was quiet around her. The refrigerator hummed. Adwoa breathed in the next room in the slow, trusting rhythm of someone who has no idea what the world is capable of, and no reason yet to learn. Nadia turned off the kitchen light. She walked down the hallway. She checked on her daughter. She did not sleep much that night. But when she lay in the dark in her father's house, her house, she was not trembling. She was not enduring. She was simply waiting for Monday, the way her father had always waited. without anxiety, without performance, and with the complete, unhurried certainty of someone who already knows how the story ends. Monday arrived the way Kwame Oay had always approached consequential things, quietly, without announcement, and with everything already in order. James Opong Asante filed the financial disclosure documents at 9:17 that morning. By 9:45, the opposing counsel had received the first package. By 10 o'clock, Brennan Cole's attorney, a senior partner at Whitfield & Crane named Douglas Merritt, had called James's office twice. James did not return either call that day. There was nothing to discuss yet. The documents spoke for themselves. They simply needed time to be read. The financial disclosure meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday in a conference room at Opong, Asante and Reeves on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Center Avenue, an Oay portfolio property, though this detail was not announced, and no one in the room that day was aware of it except Nadia and James. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse, her natural hair close-cropped and neat, a woman who had dressed with the quiet deliberateness of someone who understood that composure is its own form of preparation. She arrived 7 minutes early. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table and waited. Brennan arrived with Douglas Merritt and a junior associate whose name Nadia did not catch. Brennan had dressed carefully, too. Suit, tie, the particular performance of a man who believes appearance can still control a room. He glanced at Nadia when he entered. He looked away. James placed the first document package on the table without preamble. Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC, he said. Full financial disclosure, as required under Georgia Code Title 19. Douglas Merritt opened the cover page. He read the first paragraph. He read it again. The room went very still. It was not the silence of a dramatic moment being staged. It was the silence of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been structurally dismantled and who requires a moment to locate a new floor to stand on. Merritt turned to page 2. He turned to page 3. Brennan, who had been watching his attorney's face, went the color of someone who has stepped off a curb they did not see. James continued without expression. 203 properties across Atlanta, Savannah, Augusta, and Macon. Total assessed portfolio value, $500 billion. Annual operating income, $1.9 billion. 11 active commercial leases currently held by Cole Capital Group entities, including the primary office lease at 1140 Peachtree Street. He paused for exactly one beat. Where your client has been operating for the past 4 years under a courtesy rate extended by the late Kwame Oay. Merritt requested a recess. It was granted. Brennan stood in the hallway outside the conference room while his attorney made phone calls. Nadia did not watch him through the glass. She poured herself a glass of water and drank it. She did not perform composure. She simply had it. When the meeting resumed, James added one further item: the joint household account, frozen by Brennan 7 months prior and described at the time as a financial simplification. The account drew from an operating subsidiary of Oay Family Real Estate Partners. The funds Brennan had controlled and withheld from Nadia during her postpartum recovery were, under the structure James had prepared, reclassifiable as unauthorized draws from her LLC. The number was $342,000. Merritt wrote it down. He did not look up. The second event came 11 days later. Cole Capital Group held its annual investor presentation each October in the grand atrium of 1140 Peachtree, a tradition Brennan had established in the building's event space 4 years ago, choosing it because the 60-foot glass ceiling and the quality of the afternoon light gave the room an authority that his balance sheets, in recent years, sometimes struggled to convey on their own. He had sent the invitations 3 weeks prior. 41 investors confirmed. The catering order was placed. The AV equipment was scheduled for delivery at 7 that morning. At 7:12, Marcus Webb, the venue manager for 1140 Peachtree's Grand Atrium, received James Opong Asante at the front desk. James placed a single document on the counter. It was a lease termination notice for the event space booking, executed under the authority of Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC, signed by the sole managing member, Nadia Adwoa Oay. The notice was dated 2 days prior and was entirely within the legal rights of the property owner under the terms of the existing commercial agreement. Marcus Webb read it twice. He called the building's legal contact. He was advised to comply. By 9 that morning, Cole Capital Group's event staff arrived to find the Grand Atrium unavailable. Brennan's office scrambled to secure the hotel ballroom at the Marriott Marquise 4 blocks away. Smaller, fluorescent lit, set for a conference rather than a presentation, with the particular energy of a room assembled in 2 hours. 11 of the 41 confirmed investors arrived at 1140 Peachtree as originally directed and could not locate the event. 6 of those 11 did not find the new venue. Of the 30 who attended, 2 asked questions about the venue change that Brennan answered with explanations that did not satisfy them. By the following week, formal withdrawal notices arrived from 2 investor relationships representing a combined commitment of $88 million. 3 others sent letters requesting an audit of the Cole Capital lease portfolio. What they had found, when they looked, was a company that had been operating inside its wife's inheritance for 4 years without knowing it. The third event was not a meeting and not a legal proceeding. It was a Tuesday evening in October, 3 weeks after the disclosure, when Brennan Cole appeared at the door of the house in Cascade Heights. He had not called ahead. He rang the bell and stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets, and when Nadia opened the door, she could see in his face, for the first time, something that wasn't calculation or performance or managed charm. It was recognition. The slow, terrible recognition of a man who has finally understood the full dimensions of what he destroyed and cannot unknow it. She did not open the door wide. She stood in the frame and looked at him. He spoke for several minutes. She did not interrupt. He said that he had made a mistake. He said that he had been under pressure that she could not understand. He said that Abina was... He stopped. He started again. He said that he understood now what she had been carrying. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once. Nadia listened to all of it. She let him finish. She let the silence sit for a moment after he was done. Then she said, quietly, without heat, without cruelty, with only the full and certain weight of everything she had chosen not to say for 5 years. My father built this. You just worked in it. She closed the door. She stood on the interior side of it for a moment, one hand still resting on the handle, the wood solid and cool beneath her palm, her father's door, her father's house, her house, and she listened to his footsteps cross the porch and descend the steps and move away down the path without looking back. Then she walked down the hallway. She checked on her daughter. Adwoa was asleep, one small fist curled beside her cheek, breathing with the total unconscious trust of someone who does not yet know what the world requires of the people who love them. Nadia stood over the crib for a long time. She did not cry. She did not need to. In the weeks that followed, 3 lives contracted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way water finds its level. Each thing settling into its actual size once the borrowed air had left it. Brennan first. The 2 investor withdrawals became 4 by the end of November. The firms that stayed asked for quarterly audits going forward, a request that in the private equity world carries the specific weight of a vote of no confidence, delivered in the language of due diligence. Cole Capital Group vacated 2 of its 11 Oay portfolio leases before year's end, consolidating into a smaller footprint that fit its actual revenue rather than its projected ambitions. The 1140 Peachtree office lease, the flagship address, the one Brennan had used on letterhead and in pitch decks, and in every introduction he had given himself for 4 years, came up for standard renewal in December. The new rate was market rate. Brennan's office manager, a practical woman named Renee Foston, ran the numbers twice and told him they could not make it work at current revenue. They relocated in January to a suite on the 18th floor of a building on West Peachtree. Smaller windows, no atrium, nothing wrong with it, just the correct size. Diane Cole received her second standard commercial correspondence in November, this one regarding the renewal terms for the Ansley Park event space she had used for 4 consecutive years to host her holiday gatherings, her junior league auxiliary meetings, the annual dinner she organized each spring that served as the primary social proof of her standing in a particular Atlanta world that measured itself in exactly these ways. The new terms included a 40% rate adjustment and a 12-month contract, rather than the rolling monthly courtesy she had previously enjoyed. She made calls. She spoke to the property management office of Oay Family Real Estate Partners and was told, politely and without elaboration, that the previous arrangement had been a personal courtesy extended by the late Kwame Oay and was not a contractual right transferable to his estate. She asked to speak to the managing member. She was told that Ms. Oay's office would be in touch. Ms. Oay's office was not in touch. Diane's calls went unreturned through December. She paid the new rate in January. She told no one why the venue had changed. Abina's collapse was the quietest of the 3, and therefore, in its way, the most complete. She had left Cole Capital in September with the particular confidence of someone who believes they are moving toward something rather than away from it. By November, the something had dissolved. Brennan's professional situation was not what she had attached herself to. The wedding timeline she had described to her friends in excited, casual terms, sometime next year, we haven't set a date, you know how he is, went unmentioned and then unmentioned again until the silence on the subject became its own announcement. She sent Nadia a text in December. It was 4 sentences. It asked for nothing specific and offered nothing specific, and landed in Nadia's phone like a stone dropped into still water, creating a brief disturbance and then sinking without response. Nadia read it once. She set her phone down. She did not reply. In January, a letter arrived at Cascade Heights from Brennan. Not a legal document. A letter, handwritten on his personal stationery, 4 pages. Nadia made herself a cup of tea before she read it. She sat at the kitchen table, her father's table, her table, and read all 4 pages without rushing. He had written carefully. He had written honestly, she thought, or as honestly as a person can write when honesty has finally become the only remaining option. He said things that were true. He said things that were too late. She folded the letter. She set it beside her tea. She finished her tea. She did not respond. Then something shifted into a different register entirely. Quieter, cleaner, finally free of the weight of other people's choices. In February, Nadia formally retained Opong Asante and Reeves as full-time legal counsel for Oay Family Real Estate Partners, LLC. She sat in James's office on a Tuesday afternoon and reviewed the first board summary she had requested. All 203 properties, organized by city and revenue tier, the full scope of what her father had built laid out across 14 pages of careful documentation. She read every entry. She asked 3 questions. James answered them. She signed the retainer agreement and shook James's hand, and he said, in his precise, unhurried way, that Kwame would have approved of how she was handling things. It was the most personal thing James had ever said to her in 30 years of knowing each other. She thanked him. She meant it. One evening in late February, she drove to 1140 Peachtree after hours, let herself in through the management entrance with the key Marcus Webb had couriered to her office the previous month, and walked alone through the grand atrium. The building was empty. The cleaning crew had finished at 9. Her footsteps were soft on the marble floor. She stood in the center of the atrium and looked up at the 60-foot ceiling and the way the city light came through the glass in the dark, different from the afternoon light her father had watched, but its own kind of beautiful and entirely hers. She understood now what he had been showing her, not just a building, the proof that patience, applied with enough care and enough time, becomes something nobody can take away. She stood there for a while. Then she went home to her daughter. This story was never about money. It was never about a portfolio or a lease agreement or the precise legal architecture of a separate property trust. It was about a woman who loved carefully in a house that mistook her care for weakness, who carried an inheritance not just of wealth but of wisdom, and who learned, in the hardest possible way, at the highest possible cost, that the difference between a woman who is overlooked and a woman who is formidable is often nothing more than what she has chosen, so far, to reveal. Kwame Oay understood this. He spent 51 years proving it. He raised a daughter who finally understood it, too. If this story landed somewhere true for you, if you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, or carried something quietly that the room around you never took the time to see, leave a comment below. Tell us what this story meant to you. And if you're watching from outside the U.S., we would love to know where in the world you're joining us from. Drop your city or country in the comments. We read everyone. On the back porch of the house in Cascade Heights, on a Saturday evening in early March, Nadia Oay sat in the chair her father had kept there for 30 years, wooden, slightly worn on the armrests, facing the garden he had tended, and she was only now beginning to learn. Adwoa was asleep in the bassinet beside her, bundled in the yellow knit blanket that had been Nadia's own, that her mother had made and her father had kept folded in the cedar chest, and that Nadia had found, without looking for it, the week she came home. She held her father's letter in both hands, the paper worn soft at every fold from the weight of all those readings, and she read the last line one final time. The buildings will outlast everything they'll ever try to take from you. Stand in them like you own them. You do. She folded the letter. She looked at her daughter. The garden was very quiet. The evening was warm for March, the way Atlanta evenings sometimes are, as if the city itself has decided to offer something unexpected, free of charge, to whoever happens to be paying attention. Nadia said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence, for the first time in a very long time, was entirely hers.